The skin was cold, colder than winter rivers, colder than fear itself. When Koda's fingertip touched the girl's bony shoulder, she flinched, not with life, but like a desiccated leaf. His gaze wasn't on her face, nor her sunken empty eyes, but on the amulet resting in the hollow of her throat. A turquoise, streaked with a black line like lightning, exactly like the one he had carved for her all those years ago. "Little bird," he whispered the name that had lain like ash on his tongue for a decade. Her eyes didn't move, but a single dirty tear rolled down her cheek. It wasn't a sign of recognition. It was a sign of pain, a world of pain. That was all that lived within her. Koda saw it, and something in the ancient petrified hollow of his own chest broke. He was a man who had lived for 10 years in the company of ghosts, but this was the first time he had met a ghost of flesh and blood. Without another thought, driven only by an instinct older than grief, he slid his arms beneath her fragile body. She was feather-light, a collection of sharp bones and thin skin that weighed nothing. As he lifted her, a soft, rattling moan escaped her, and for a terrifying moment he feared she would crumble to dust at his touch. He moved through the hostile landscape with the fluid, purposeful silence of a hunter, yet he was not hunting. He was protecting. Every step was deliberate, his eyes reading the ground, not for tracks, but for the gentlest path to minimize the jolts for the fragile burden in his arms. The sun beat down relentlessly from the sky, and Koda positioned his own body to cast shade over the girl, a living shield against a world that clearly wanted to destroy her. His camp was little more than a rock overhang, offering shelter from the worst weather, the refuge of a man who wished not to live, but merely to exist. He laid her gently on his single blanket. Her fever was like a fire burning beneath her skin, a dry, consuming heat. Again, he did not speak. His hand spoke for him. He moved with the quiet efficiency that survival had taught him, water from his leather flask, not directly to her mouth, but onto a cloth with which he dabbed her cracked lips, drop by drop. He gathered leaves from a desert sagebrush, ground them into a paste, and applied it to the worst of her open wounds. His movements were a meditation, a choreography of competence that silenced his thoughts. Every gesture was a silent argument against death. Day and night blurred into a cycle of feverish heat and cool darkness. He forced a thin, warm broth of dried meat and herbs down her throat, spoon by spoon. He cleansed her, washing the dirt from her skin, and with each touch he felt the sharp edges of her ribs, her spine, her hips, the map of unimaginable suffering. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rigid emptiness in her eyes gave way to a deep, restless exhaustion. The rattling breath grew quieter, the skin lost some of its spectral coldness. On the third day, she twitched in her sleep. Her eyes fluttered beneath their lids, trapped in a dream that was torture. She let out a choked sound, a mix of a whimper and a scream. Koda leaned over her, ready to soothe her with a gentle touch. But before he could, her lips formed a word, no more than a hoarse croak, but so full of absolute terror that the air in the camp seemed to freeze. Koda left the girl in the safety of his hideout, a small, sleeping bundle of hope and horror. The name she had whispered Cain was a poisoned seed taking root in his mind. It wasn't an Apache name. It was hard, cold, a name like the sound of a hammer on steel. With nothing but that sound as a compass, Koda moved like smoke through the landscape, following the faint tracks that led to watering holes and trading posts. In every dusty outpost, he listened to the conversations of prospectors and trappers, a silent shadow searching for an echo of that harsh name. And he found it. Rumors spoke of a mining town called Redemption, deep in the Badlands, a place ruled by a man named Silas Cain, a man who brought order with an iron fist and a full purse. Redemption was a wound on the landscape. From a distance, from the rocky hills overlooking it, Koda saw not a town, but a disease. Barren slopes scarred with mine shafts, a cluster of wooden shacks clinging to the ground like scabs, and a constant, low sound, the distant, relentless clang of metal on stone. He watched for days, sensing the rhythm of the place, the way men walked to the mine with bowed heads and returned with empty eyes. He saw men who were the law, not by a star, but by the heavy revolvers hanging at their hips. On the third day, he left his vantage point and slid down the slope, not as a man, but as a part of the rock and shadow. His goal was to get closer, to immerse himself in the stench of the place, to understand the source of Cain's power. But his presence was already a crime. 3 of Cain's men, broad as oxen and with cruel bored eyes, intercepted him at the base of a dry riverbed. They saw no man seeking answers. They saw only an Apache, and in their small world, that was reason enough. "You're lost, Redskin," the leader said. And it wasn't a question. Koda said nothing. He simply stood, letting their words, their unspoken threats, bounce off him. This was his terrain. The rocks, the thorny bushes, the treacherous ground, it was his home, and they were the intruders. When they drew their weapons, Koda was already in motion. He was not an outburst of violence, but a demonstration of efficiency. He used their own inertia against them, a jabbed elbow that unbalanced one man, a swift step that put him behind the second. He didn't break bones, he didn't strike to kill, he targeted nerve points, tendons, the joints that allowed movement. There was no carnage, only 3 loud groans as 3 large men fell to the ground like felled trees, unable to move, their eyes filled with shock and disbelief. He disarmed them and melted back into the landscape even before the dust settled. He had won, but he had also made a mistake. He had shown them he existed. Now, Cain knew he was being watched. Night was his ally. Under the cold, indifferent light of the stars, redemption was a different beast, quieter, but full of secrets. Koda slipped through the shadows, an invisible presence. He wasn't looking for a jail with bars. He knew the chains in this place weren't always iron. He followed an instinct, the faint sound of a child whimpering in its sleep, and it led him to a long, low shack at the edge of the camp. It wasn't a prison. It was worse. An infirmary, where the air was thick and heavy with the scent of illness and despair. In the filthy beds lay children, dozens of them, no older than 10, their faces sunken, their bodies as thin as the girl he had found. They were the fuel that kept this mine running. And as Koda drew closer, he saw it, the proof of ownership, a small, subtle brand mark on each child's ankle, the shape of a Cain's. The name wasn't just that of a man, it was the mark of an owner. The rage that rose in Koda was a cold, controlled fire, but he needed to know more. He had to find the root of this evil. Cain's office was a fortress in the heart of the town, the only stone building. Koda climbed onto the roof like a lizard, dropped silently through an open window, and entered the inner sanctum. The room smelled of leather, whiskey, and power. Maps claiming Cain's dominion hung on the wall. And on the massive desk lay a ledger, thick and bound in leather. Koda opened it. There were names, dates, prices, a detailed record of human misery. He flipped back, his heart pounding against his ribs, a wild drum of fear and foreboding. And then he found it. An entry from 10 years ago. The writing was precise, emotionless. Acquired, when Apache girl, approx. 5 years old, called Little Bird by her mother. Koda's world crumbled to ash, the ghost that had hunted him for 10 years, the emptiness that had devoured him from within, the endless question. It all started here. The abduction, his daughter, this place, this monster. Everything was connected. The man he was, a silent, grieving spirit, died in that moment. What remained in his shell was something else, something harder. The pain of tragedy transformed into the terrible clarity of vengeance. Driven by a rage that burned away all reason, he forgot to be a ghost. He became a warrior. He stormed out of the office, not into the shadows, but into the moonlight, letting out a blood-curdling war cry. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted to annihilate. But Cain was a master of human nature. He had expected such an outburst. The sharp click of cocked hammers came from all the surrounding rooftops. Torches flared, turning the night into a harsh, nightmarish day. Koda was surrounded. He had walked into a trap. Cain stepped out of the saloon, slowly, a drink in his hand, his face a calm mask of amused control. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice as smooth as polished stone. "Grief makes a man so predictable." Koda stood there, caught in the net of his own fury. Cain's men struck him from behind, and he fell to his knees. Cain stepped closer, his eyes glinting with cruel satisfaction. "You look at me like a demon," he sneered. "But you and I, we are more alike than you think. The great Koda, the butcher of Ash Creek, the brutal Apache raider. You see, the only way my men could enter your village and take the child was if you yourself were known for doing the exact same thing." The words were poison, but they carried the sting of truth. Koda had lived a different life 10 years ago, a life he wanted to bury, but one that had never truly died. "But you want your revenge, don't you?" Cain continued. "Let me take it from you." He took a sip of his drink. "I sold Little Bird years ago to some prospectors heading west. Maybe she's dead, maybe she's the Queen of California, I don't know. And I'll never know." He smiled. "All your rage, all your suffering, it has no target. It's useless." Cain's men struck. Each blow was aimed not just at the body, but at the soul. They left him in the dirt, a bloody, broken shell. As the lights of redemption faded behind him, they threw him into the desert to be eaten by vultures, a man who had been stripped of everything, even the satisfaction of his own revenge. As he lost consciousness, his face pressed against the cold sand. His last thought was not anger, but emptiness. And then, as darkness enveloped him, he saw high in the sky a dark speck, a single eagle, circling in the cold moonlight, a silent, watchful witness to his deepest fall. Death did not come for Koda. Instead, the desert sent him a harsher punishment, clarity. When he awoke under the burning sun, his body a symphony of pain, he did not feel the rage of the night before. He felt the truth of Cain's words, sharp as a knife. His revenge had never been for his daughter. It was for him. A selfish balm for a 10-year-old wound, to silence the ghost of his own guilt. He saw the eagle still circling high above, an unmoving speck in the sky, and understood. It was not an omen of death, it was a witness, and it was a question. What would he live for, now that the comfortable lie of his revenge had been taken from him? The ghost of Little Bird had only been that, a ghost. But the children in that mine were real. Their fear was real. Their pain was real. Koda rose, every muscle protesting, but his mind was clearer than ever. His rage had not vanished. It had transformed from the hot, impetuous flame of revenge into the cold, focused glow of redemption. His purpose was not to avenge the past. It was to secure a future for the living. He had a new plan. Not a warrior's plan, but a spirit's plan. Cain was right. Grief made a man predictable, but redemption made him unpredictable. Koda did not return to redemption as an attacker. He became part of the landscape, a whisper on the wind. Cain had guards posted on the slopes, but they were looking for a man. Koda was not one. He moved at night, mapping the mine's weaknesses not as a soldier, but as an engineer of decay. He knew the language of rock and wood, knew which support beams were oldest, which cracks would give way under pressure. He used his skills not to destroy, but to dismantle Cain's machine from within. With precise, methodical acts of sabotage, he ensured that tunnels collapsed and equipment failed. Silver production dried up, and Cain's empire began to choke at its source. With each act of sabotage, Koda performed a silent liberation. Under the cover of confusion, he crept into the infirmary and freed the children, not all at once, but in small groups of 2 or 3. He was a legend whispered among them, the Apache ghost who came for the lost children. He didn't take them into the wilderness, but to the frightened, oppressed townspeople of redemption, the blacksmiths, the stable hands, the women who had silently suffered under Cain's tyranny. He didn't just give them the children, he gave them back their weapons, and with them, their courage. The final act was a masterpiece of silent warfare. Koda used the knowledge he had gained about the mind to trigger a controlled chain reaction, not an explosive firework display, but a deep groaning rumble as the main entrance to the mine, Cain's pride and joy, collapsed, burying his source of wealth under tons of rock. As the town descended into chaos, the residents emerged from the shadows, no longer frightened, but armed and united. The final battle did not take place in the dusty streets, but in Cain's office, the stone heart of his fallen empire. Cain was no coward. He waited for Koda alone, a bottle of whiskey and a revolver on the desk. The fight was short, brutal, and personal. It was not the battle of a warrior against a tyrant, but the battle of 2 men who were dark mirrors of each other. But Koda no longer fought out of hatred. He fought for the children, for the future, for the tiny chance of peace in his own soul. And that made him stronger. He disarmed Cain, breaking not his body, but his will. The victory was not the sound of a gunshot, but the sound of Cain's revolver falling uselessly to the floor. The days after Cain's fall were marked by a strange, uncertain hope. The town, built on greed and fear, had to learn to live on something else. And Koda, the man who had only wanted to exist, found that he had to stay. He watched the liberated children, saw their wary eyes slowly turn to curiosity, and he looked at her, the girl who might once have been his daughter, the girl he now called Anna. She was slowly recovering, her cheeks regaining some color, her limbs some strength. The final scene was not a dramatic farewell. It was quiet, simple, but full of meaning. Koda stood at the edge of the town with Anna and a small group of the older children. The sun was rising, painting the sky in the colors of a new promise. Koda did not ride away. Instead, he knelt in the dust, took a stick, and drew a sign in the earth, the track of a coyote. He looked up at the children, and for the first time in 10 years, his eyes were not haunted by ghosts. "This is the first lesson," he said, his voice rough from long silence. "This is how you read the story the earth tells." He passed on his knowledge, not to a son of his blood, but to the children he had rescued from the darkness. It was not revenge. It was not peace. It was something better. It was a legacy.